Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning for the art of negotiating. We're going to talk today about how to get the best deals for the buyers or sellers that you're working with. There are no handouts that go with today's program. We're going to just have a short discussion on how to be a great negotiator. Slide's not advancing. Oh, there we go. So negotiation is a method by which people will settle differences. It's a process by which compromise or agreement is reached while avoiding argument and dispute. So at the end of the day, what's interesting about this business is that we're always treading a line that working with other real estate agents who are representing other parties, and oftentimes we have relationships with those other real estate agents, but we always need to be representing our client, our buyer or seller, the best that we can, regardless of relationships we have with those real estate agents. So people aim to achieve the best possible outcome for their position. However, the principles of fairness, seeking a mutual benefit, and maintaining a relationship are the true keys to a successful outcome. So there are three principles of negotiating: strength, flexibility, and mindfulness. So strength is just about educating your clients on the market, the comps, and competition. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about buyers, and then we're going to talk about how to be a great negotiator for your sellers. But one of the things that you want to do is, when speaking with your client, whomever it is trying to figure out wants versus needs at the beginning of your relationship. So for example, at the beginning of working with a buyer, figure out at that point, when there's no emotion involved and they know they're going to be out looking for a house, if you can separate the things that they absolutely want versus what they absolutely need. Same with sellers, by the way, like figuring out what is it that they absolutely want out of the sale of their property versus what they absolutely need to get when it comes to selling the property. Because when emotions get involved during negotiations, all of it changes. All of a sudden, the things they said that they wanted but didn't need, everything gets skewed, and these little teeny issues become massive issues. So at the beginning, when there's no emotion involved, if you can figure out the wants versus needs, you can refer back to that at a later time when you can say, hey, remember at the beginning all this, what your goal was, what you wanted versus what you needed. Remember to be flexible. The best negotiators are creative ones. There's more than one way to skin a cat. A great example of this is, I was talking with a real estate agent who was working with a buyer, and the buyer was like, nope, I absolutely can't afford more than, let's say, $200,000. They were fixed on a price of a house that they could afford. And so they had found a house they liked, and let's say it was priced at $220,000. So it was higher than what they were looking to pay. And they said, nope, I absolutely will not pay more than $200,000. They did some negotiating. The seller came down to $210,000. What's interesting is that the real estate agent realized that even though this person was stuck on a number of $200,000, that really wasn't what they were stuck on, because $200,000 isn't like a mortgage payment. So it required that the agent do a little more digging and figure out, well, why does it have to be $200,000? Because you're qualified for $275,000. So why are you stuck at $200,000? And then it got down to the fact that they wanted a specific payment, and that these people felt that they would not be comfortable if their payment went above a certain amount. So then the real estate agent said, well, did you explore other mortgage options? Because maybe there's a way that we could make this work so that you could still get your payment to where you want it, even though the price is higher than, say, the $200,000 that you think you can pay. And the result of that was because of the creativity of the agent, who then went and worked with a mortgage person, and they ended up working out this mortgage product where the end price ended up being $215,000 for the property. But the mortgage person, instead of having monthly private mortgage insurance, they did an upfront private mortgage insurance. So many people know if you're putting less than 20% down, you have a PMI or a private mortgage insurance included in your monthly payment. But there are programs out there for less than a 20% down payment with no monthly mortgage insurance, because all the mortgage insurance gets paid up front. So in this particular situation, they worked out a deal where it was like $215,000, but the seller was paying all the private mortgage insurance up front for the buyer. So in the end, the buyer ended up getting exactly what he really wanted, which was a mortgage payment under a certain amount. Even though he said what he wanted was a $200,000 price, that's not really what he wanted. So the best negotiators are the ones that keep asking questions to really figure out, like, what is the motivation behind what the client says they want. And then once you get to the true motivation, can you creatively get them what they want in a way different than what they were looking at. So when it comes to negotiating, we already talked about like finding out wants versus needs from your clients early on when there's no emotion tied to the situation. You'll also want to refer back to that. You're going to want to constantly coach your clients to step into the shoes of the other party that they're negotiating with. Negotiations are often centered on money, but there's a lot underneath the dollar sign that is controlling the deal. So it's really important when you are negotiating on a transaction that you can get to the heart of all the underlying issues, because if you know those underlying issues, then you can successfully negotiate a transaction. So one thing I always tell real estate agents is always negotiate something, because too often, and we've all seen it as real estate agents, that our house comes on the market, our buyer goes and puts in a full price offer, closing in 30 days, and their offer gets accepted, and now all of a sudden, because their offer got accepted, nothing was negotiated, now they're like, oh boy, did I make a mistake? So it's always a good idea to ask for something, just so the client doesn't step back and say, hey, wait a second, I didn't negotiate, so does that mean that I got a bad deal? So always negotiate for something. Before any negotiation takes place, a decision needs to be taken as to when and where a meeting will take place to discuss the problem and who will attend. Setting up a limited time frame is often helpful. The only point here is I say to real estate agents that when it comes to working with buyers and sellers, when you know an offer is coming in, like, have a true strategy behind your negotiations. Don't have a tactic, like just wait for an offer to come in and then call the person and say, are you willing to take the offer? Like, always have a conversation with your buyer or seller about what your strategy is going to be when the negotiations are taking place. So you're working with the seller and an offer comes in on the property. When it comes time to negotiate, like, think about all the worst case scenarios. So, for example, say, okay, if you're going to accept this offer, are you going to be okay with the fact that they're going to do a home inspection and 2 weeks from now they might ask for money off? Let's decide now what's going to happen when that happens 2 weeks from now, instead of just ignoring that and getting your seller to accept an offer and not even telling them that there's a chance that this is going to be negotiated again. So have a strategy. Make sure you let your buyers and sellers know what negotiations look like.
And yesterday we talked about the pre-listing home inspection, which helps with that as well, to help prepare them.
100%. So let's talk about buyer being a great negotiator great negotiator on the buyer side. So how can you get the best deal for your potential buyer? We're going to talk about some things you can do. First of all, when you are working for a buyer, if you want to get yourself in the best negotiating position, one way to do that is your buyer can ask that you present the offer in person to the seller. Now, the seller can, of course, say no to that, but you can at least ask if your buyer wants you to go present that offer directly to a seller. You have to go through the listing agent, request access to the seller, request a meeting. But the beauty of that is that you have a chance to sell your buyer directly to that seller with no middleman in between. The reason it sometimes works, especially if you think about it, like in multi-offer situations where the seller's getting 5 offers on the property, if you can be the one that goes and presents the offer, you put yourself in a better position than all the other offers on the table, because you can overcome any objection that the seller has, etc. So why would somebody as a buyer agent want to present an offer? You're best suited to explain the offer. That's number one. Number two, you are not relying on a listing agent's negotiating skills. Just because you have skills negotiating a deal doesn't mean that the other party, the other real estate agent, has any negotiating skills. So take that off the table. See if you can present the offer directly. The other great thing about presenting an offer directly to a seller is you can see nonverbal cues. So you get to see and hear and get all kinds of information that you would normally not have any access to if you're just going through their real estate agent. So at the end of the day, by getting in front of getting your buyer's offer directly in front of the seller, you get to extract data that no other buyer agent would potentially have on the property. Another great way to negotiate, I'm a huge fan, especially in a market like we had last summer with crazy bidding wars on property. I am a fan of buyer agents encouraging their buyers to write a letter from the heart to the seller, tugging at their heartstrings to explain why they want a particular property. When it comes to negotiating, we forget that emotions play a massive role in the negotiating process for our clients, the buyers and sellers. So one of the ways that we can use emotions to our advantage is to have our buyer write just a heartfelt letter to the seller on why they want this property. This helps you get your offer accepted in a multi-bid situation. And it also is a great tool to use if you're trying to negotiate for less than what the asking price is. So the house is listed for $400, your people are putting in an offer for $350. Have your buyers write a letter, emotional, heartfelt letter about why they want this property. Another thing to do as a buyer agent is to prepare a CMA. So I think this is not very common, and I am surprised that more buyer agents don't do that. But when you're working with a buyer and you're about to write up an offer on a property with a potential client, what the norm is in our business is you look at what the asking price of the property is, then you ask your buyer, like, how much do you want to put your offer in for, and then you write the offer. But one extra step that could really differentiate you from other real estate agents is you say to your client, we're going to do a complete market analysis on any property that we're going to be putting an offer in. The beauty of a market analysis is that you will find properties that are overpriced, and one easy way to get a seller to come down on that price is that if you could show a market analysis to say, hey, your house is priced at $400,000, but all the comps around it are saying that this is worth $370,000. So we're putting in our offer at $370,000. We don't want to have to come back and negotiate in another month because it doesn't appraise. We feel it will most likely appraise around $370,000, and here's all the data that we have to support it. So that way when you're negotiating with the other agent or the seller, You're working off of data and not an opinion. Not just saying, hey, your house is overpriced. You're saying, I believe your house might be overpriced because of this data, and here's the data that I found on it. So not a bad idea to always do a market analysis for your buyers to put your buyer in the best negotiating position. Next, the list side, how to be a better negotiator on listings. As Susan mentioned, one way to do that is to encourage your sellers to do a pre-listing home inspection. So I talk about this in the book, The 7 Secrets to Hiring a Lion. It is not something that many real estate agents do. It is a strategy that's a little different. There are, by the way, real estate agents in our market that do this on every listing, and they use that as part of their value proposition when they go on a listing presentation. They get all of their sellers to do a pre-listing home inspection. But the whole idea of a pre-listing home inspection is that when you list the property, you encourage the seller to have a complete home inspection done on their property. So the seller goes and pays some money to have a home inspector come out. Why is that helpful in negotiating? Because it allows you to help anchor a price that is not going to move down the road. What typically happens, and what most sellers don't realize happens until after they've listed the property and after they've gone through the process, is that seller will list the property, a buyer comes in, puts an offer in, they accept the offer, they're all excited, they got what they wanted for the property, and then 2 weeks go by, the home inspection gets done, and now the buyers say, we want $20,000 off the price of the property because the house needs all these repairs. But what happens if the seller had done all that to begin with? They did their home inspection, and they find out that the house has some issues, and they fix most of those issues before they even list the property. That's number one. Number two, the seller also says, well, there's a few things I just can't fix. I can't afford to fix the fact that our roof is 20 years old and eventually it's going to have to be replaced. But what I can do is when somebody shows interest in the house, we can say, we listed the property, we had a home inspection. If you want to see that, you're welcome to look at it. We know that the roof is 20 years old, and we priced the home accordingly. By doing this additional legwork and doing the inspection in advance, you are less likely to see massive negotiations on price when a buyer does come in and put an offer, because they know the property has been inspected. You as a seller already know what is going to come in that home inspection, and everything is fully disclosed to the potential buyer, so they put in their offer according. So you can say to a potential buyer, we know the roof is 20 years old, we priced it accordingly, so when you put your offer in, put an offer in knowing that that roof is going to have to be replaced in the next 5 years, so that you don't have a massive adjustment or a buyer asking for tons of money off of a home inspection. I always say to sellers that the cost of doing work is far less expensive when the seller has to go out and price out, like getting paint jobs done, than when a buyer who is negotiating for the best deal possible, all of a sudden they go out and price out all these things. It's going to be far more expensive for the seller. The other thing you can do as a listing agent to be a great negotiator for your seller is that when somebody shows interest in the property, when you have another agent coming in or a buyer coming in, share your CMA so that you can say to the other agent, the buyer agent, or to the buyer directly, this is how we price the property, so that you're being totally transparent, saying the house is priced at $400,000. These are the comps we use, and this is why we feel we can get a $400,000 price. The other piece that I think is a great tool to think about when you're listing a property is keep red herrings off the table for now. So what that means is when you are listing a property and the seller says, as they're taking you through the house, they say, oh yeah, when you list the property, I don't want to keep the refrigerator, I don't want the washer and dryer. Like, the new buyer can just have it all. They can have everything. A red herring is that you don't put any of that into the offering. So when you list the property, you say, we are not including the refrigerator, we are not including the washer and dryer, we are not including the shed that's on the property. Now, what we know is the seller really doesn't care about any of those things, and they're cool with throwing it all in. But if you keep those out of the negotiating right now, like keep them off, they're just not part of the offering, when that buyer comes back and is negotiating other stuff, the buyer comes back and says, hey, we want $5,000 off the price because there's some work that we didn't realize was going to have to be done. Now you've got all these red herrings, you've got all these little things that you can say, hey, we're not going to come down $5,000 in price, but my seller has said that so that your buyer is happy, what they're going to do is throw in the refrigerator, throw in the washer and dryer, and they're going to let you keep the shed that's on the property. So that's $5,000 worth of stuff that your people are getting. So in that instance, you just made it so your seller is 100% whole because you threw back in stuff that you knew they didn't even want anyways. So when listing a property, look for those red herrings. Look for those things that the seller says, hey, I don't care about any of this stuff. Throw it all in. They can have it. You say, you know what, we're going to keep those off the table for now because those are part of our negotiating down the road if we need to throw something in for the buyer. So the other piece I like to talk about is, especially when working with a buyer, is to do an active investigation. Now, anybody who's been through some of our other classes, I say when you're representing your seller, you should not disclose anything to a potential buyer or to a potential buyer agent about the seller. You don't want the other agent to know that the client is getting a divorce and has to move, or that the client is behind on a month behind or 2 months behind on a mortgage payment, or that they're being relocated necessarily. It's nobody's, that you have a duty of confidentiality. However, when you're working with a buyer, this is all information that would be great to know. And so I always say when you're working with a buyer that you should call the other real estate agent who has the listing and ask questions. How much is the seller willing to move on price? The questions when a buyer agent calls you and says, hey, how come your seller's selling? You say, not disclosing that information. None of your...
Another point about that, if you're the buyer agent and you say to the seller, what would they prefer for a closing? And we talked about this in one of the other classes. If it's in April and the seller agent says, my people would really love it if they could let their kids finish the school year out, you might not be the top offer in a multiple offer situation, but you're the only one that offered the end of June closing. And you win because you've asked that question.
That's a great point. I do think that you can always ask the other side what really matters to the client. So by calling the listing agent and say, is there anything that you can tell me that would help make my offer stronger? Because it could be something as simple as, hey, they want to finish out the school year. So I think it's definitely always a good idea to call the other agent, pry for some information. And sometimes they're going to say little hints that no other agent who's writing an offer on that property has even cared to ask. So it makes it so that now you're in the position to best represent your client. This keeps kicking me off. Client, always keep everything as close to the vest as possible, but when it comes to asking questions about the other party, at least ask. So for your people, only disclose if it's pertinent, but for the other side, ask and see what you can get. When you're discussing strategy with your client, always go back to their wants versus needs. When you're in the middle of a negotiation and everybody's high emotion, that's where things get skewed, where people are like, all of a sudden, like we talked about a few minutes ago, that the seller told you from day one that they don't want the shed in their backyard. So you didn't put it as part of the negotiations. Now there's emotions involved and buyers and sellers don't like each other because of a pricing issue. And now the buyer says, well, I'd be interested in the shed in the backyard. And now the seller's like, I love that shed. Do you know how long I've had that shed? All of a sudden the shed is something that they're emotionally attached to. That's why at the beginning of your negotiating strategies, like figure out the stuff that really matters so you can refer back and say, hey, do you remember when we met 2 months ago? You specifically told me that you didn't even care about that shed. Always know what the end goal is for your client, what they really care about. Like we talked about before, they didn't care about the $200,000 price. They cared about a specific payment. Talk about how negotiations take place, that it's a process that's not just like one negotiating thing. It's that a deal can continue to be negotiated literally up through the closing date. And always let your clients know all the different areas that can be negotiated. So you can say, you know what, if we don't get our price, what we can say is that we need this specific date. Or we might not be able to get the price, but we can maybe ask for things in the house like a washer and dryer and a shed in the backyard. So let your clients, both buyers and sellers, know that there's all different areas of a contract that can be negotiated. Biggest mistake real estate agents sometimes make on transactions is just not discussing a strategy at all. So often, the real estate agent literally never talks about negotiating strategy with their buyers or their sellers. And they kind of like, it all happens. Negotiating is absolutely going to happen, but it gives you an opportunity to like show your stuff and show what makes you different than other real estate agents when you have a full discussion with your buyer and with your seller about the negotiating process and areas where you can help them get the most or get closer to what they want. He who keeps his emotions in check wins. Always refer back to the wants and needs list because you'll see it on multiple transactions where the things that were not a need quickly become a need of a client when emotions get involved. So you want to always have that list of things at a point in time when there is no emotion involved from the buyer or seller. At a point in time when there's zero emotion, that's when you get the list of the things that really matter to the client, because in many instances you're going to have to refer back to that list when emotions get high. Great negotiating strategy from Grant Cardone. So Grant Cardone has some awesome books on how to be a great salesperson, like Be Obsessed or Be Average, or Sell or Be Sold. And in his books, he is a huge advocate of always agree. Every time you disagree with the other side, you add a brick wall to between you. So he says, never tell somebody you disagree. Even if in your head, if you totally disagree with the other person, the worst thing you can say is, you're wrong, I disagree, etc. He always says, open it and say, I totally agree with you. Then say whatever your opinion is. And even though the opinion might not match the fact that you agree, when you say you agree, the other person backs down and can receive your message. When you start a sentence with, I disagree or you're wrong, you have put up a wall. The other side cannot even hear your message that you're saying. So start your sentences, I totally agree with you, but this. Always set the bar with the other agent. So in most transactions, there's going to be a buyer and a seller. There's always a buyer and a seller. And in most transactions, there's two real estate agents, a buyer agent and a seller agent. Always set the tone early on with the other agent. We've all seen those agents who are very difficult to work with, And when you see that they've listed a property that you know your client's going to want, you're like, oh man, do I even want to show this house because I'm going to have to work with this agent. But if you can set the bar early on in the transaction and say, listen, our goal is the same. You want to get this house sold? I want to get this house sold. Let's work together. We can, together, you and I can pull off an awesome transaction so that at the end of the day, both our people get what they want. So set the tone early on that you want to be an advocate, like you want to work with them. You don't want it to be adversarial, that you're going to be fighting throughout the transactions. So think about and be careful, like the words you're using when you're working with the other agents. So use words like when this deal goes together instead of if this deal goes together. No matter how tough the negotiations get, always assume that the deal is going to get done. Make it clear that the parties want the same result. Use positive wording when talking to your clients, the attorneys, and the other agent. So when the deal gets done, this is going to happen. Always remember, and this goes back to the point I made at the beginning of the program about the person that kept saying, I can't go over a $200,000 house. I can't go over a $200,000 house. There's always more than one way to get what the person really wants. So don't be so stuck on saying, okay, my client says he can only get $200,000 and we can't go past $200,000. Dig, 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 and figure out what it is. When a buyer and seller are at a stalemate, so buyer and sellers are negotiating an offer on a property, and now they're $10,000 apart. That $10,000 comes down to $40 in a mortgage payment. So when it comes to negotiating, some of that's going to be like you talking to your buyer and saying, you know what, right now, I know you're stuck on the fact that they won't come down $10,000, but I want you to really think about that it's really $40 per month. So that's what we're talking about, is that we are $40 a month from you having the home of your dreams. Is it possible there are other ways that you could save the $40 so you feel comfortable just accepting the offer as is? So think about that, because not only are you going to be negotiating with the other side, sometimes you got to negotiate with the people that you're representing so that they can see what's best for them. So, hey, I know you feel like you're stuck and you want to walk away from this deal because they won't come down $10,000, but what if you just gave up your coffee habit? Right? You're down to your $40 and you can have the house that you want. Home sale contingencies, couple things to think about is if you're working with a buyer and they want, if you're working for a buyer, can't hurt to ask for a home sale contingency if they have a house to sell. If you're working for the seller, you would only accept a home sale contingency if there's some sort of kick-out clause so you can keep marketing the property. I'd say whenever an offer comes in, you should always ask if there's another home for sale, because agents do tricky things in their wording. So you might not realize that there's a home sale contingency, because sometimes what real estate agents do is they will put their offer in and it's subject to getting a mortgage for the property. What they didn't tell you is that the only way they qualify for the mortgage is that they have to sell their other house. So that's kind of a sneaky way of a real estate agent sneaking in a home sale contingency that you don't see. So always a good idea that when you're working with a seller and a buyer offer comes in, that you ask that other agent, do they have a house to sell? Multiple offer situations. How do you win a multiple offer situation? You can present the offer. We talked about that earlier, so that you're getting in front of the person. You can do $2,500 over the next highest offer, not to exceed this amount. So just kind of like a shifting price offer, so that you're basically paying the highest price. You could offer a bonus to the list agent. I have a highly successful real estate flipper who has made a killing going out there finding great real estate deals, because he offers a bonus to the agents who find him the best deal. So they're getting paid more than what's offered in MLS because the buyer of the property says, hey, I'm going to throw another $1,000 at any property you bring to me. The other way to win a multiple offer situation for your buyer is to talk to them about removing contingencies. So quick recap for our negotiating class. Remember the principles of fairness, seeking mutual benefit, and maintaining a relationship are the keys to a successful outcome. The 3 principles of negotiating are strength, flexibility, and mindfulness. Always remember to separate the wants versus needs at the beginning of the process before emotions are involved, so you can refer back to those later when the emotions run high for everyone. The best negotiators are the creative ones. Remember, there's always more than one way to skin a cat. Mindfulness. Coach your clients to step into the shoes of the other side. Best way to get what you want is to figure out how you can match with what you want with what the other party wants. So if you can get your people to step into the shoes of the other party, you're more likely to get what you want. For buyer agents, request to present offers, and you can better control negotiations. On the list side, do a pre-listing home inspection to control negotiations. Do an active investigation by always asking the other agent questions. And remember, when those questions get asked of you, when you're representing your seller, you should not disclose information that's going to put your seller in a bad negotiating position. But as a buyer agent, can't hurt to ask and see what kind of information you can dig up from the other agent. When emotions do get out of control, which they tend to sometimes do in our business, always refer back to that want versus needs list. Always agree with the other side. So in other words, even if you disagree, never say I disagree or you're wrong. Say I agree with you. Then go on to make your point. Don't get roped into a home sale contingency without knowing it. Always ask, as a listing agent, always ask when an offer comes in, is there a house to sell? And know how to prepare your buyers for multiple offer situations. Couple great books when it comes to being a great negotiator. Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In. So Getting to Yes is a fantastic book, and it was actually a school when I went to law school. This was a required reading on how to be a great negotiator. And another great book is Crucial Conversations: How to Have Important Conversations with People. So 2 great books, and then that is it for The Art of Negotiating. Thanks for joining us.